The rancher had lived alone for so many years that his days blended into one long stretch of silence. His morning started before the sun rose, when the cold air still carried the smell of dew and the land looked pale under the dim light. He would step outside, stretch his tired shoulders, and begin the same routine he had done for years, feeding the cattle, checking the water troughs, fixing whatever needed fixing, and making sure the ranch stayed alive. He rarely spoke to anyone. He rarely needed to. The wide-open land was his company, and the wind felt like the only thing that listened. His name was Thomas, but most people in town simply called him the Quiet Rancher. They meant no harm by it. They just knew he preferred keeping to himself. Life had shaped him that way. He had lost his parents early, and his brother had moved far east to chase work in another state. Thomas stayed behind, not because he wanted to be alone, but because he believed someone had to keep the ranch going. The land carried the memory of his family, and he felt it was his duty to protect it. Over time, that duty became his whole world. One late afternoon, after a long day under the sun, Thomas decided to ride the long trail that curved behind the hills. A storm had been building all morning, and he wanted to check the fence line before the heavy winds hit. The sky looked like it carried a warning. Clouds rolled in dark layers, and the wind turned sharp, pushing dust across the dry grass. Even his horse Dusty felt uneasy. The animal tossed its head gently, as if reminding Thomas that something wasn't right. They kept moving, slow but steady, until Thomas noticed something strange in the distance. He squinted under the fading light. At first it looked like a piece of torn cloth hanging from a tree branch. It swung back and forth in the rising wind, catching the last rays of daylight. Thomas almost ignored it, thinking it might just be old fabric left behind by travelers. But something inside him stirred, a feeling he never ignored. His horse felt it too, slowing down without a command. The closer he rode, the more his chest tightened. The shape didn't look like fabric anymore. It looked heavier, darker, and terribly still. Thomas stopped his horse several yards away, his stomach dropping as his eyes adjusted. It wasn't cloth. It was a person, a young woman. She was hanging from the tree. Thomas froze where he sat. For a long moment he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. His heart hit hard against his ribs, each beat louder than the wind rushing past. His hands shook as he climbed off his horse. He had seen pain before. He had seen loss and the cruel ways life sometimes treated people. But this sight felt different. It felt wrong on a deeper level. He ran toward her, stumbling once on the uneven ground. Her body hung limp, her head tilted forward, her hair covering part of her face. Her clothes were dusty and torn, and her arms hung lifelessly by her sides. Thomas reached up, grabbed the rope with trembling hands, and pulled her closer so he could cut the knot. His knife sliced through the rough rope faster than he expected, and the girl fell gently into his arms. He lowered her to the ground slowly, carefully, as if she could break in his hands. The earth was cool beneath her, and the wind carried the heavy smell of an approaching storm. Thunder rumbled far away, echoing through the open land. Thomas knelt beside her, his breath shaky. He touched her wrist gently, searching for a pulse even though he didn't believe there would be one. Her skin felt cold, too cold, and her lips had lost their color. Her eyes were closed, and her face had a peaceful stillness that frightened him even more. He whispered something he didn't understand himself. Maybe a prayer, maybe a plea, maybe just the sound of a man hoping for a miracle. He pressed his fingers to her neck, expecting nothing. But then, faint and slow, he felt a weak movement. A tiny thump under his fingertips. His eyes widened. He leaned closer, his heart racing now not from fear, but from shock. She wasn't gone. She was still fighting. He checked again to be sure. Another faint beat, another soft breath that barely lifted her chest. Thomas's whole body felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Relief washed through him, but fear followed right after. She was alive, yes, but she was hanging moments ago. Whoever had left her there had intended for her not to survive. He couldn't leave her here. Not in the open, not with a storm coming, not when she was clinging to life by the thinnest thread. Thomas gathered her gently in his arms. She weighed almost nothing to him, not because she was light, but because adrenaline had turned his strength into something fierce. He carried her to his horse and placed her carefully in the saddle. She slumped forward, so he climbed up behind her, holding her steady against his chest so she wouldn't fall. The first drops of rain fell as he turned his horse toward the ranch. They were cold and harsh, hitting his face like small stones. The sky rumbled again, and the wind grew louder. Dusty moved fast, sensing urgency in Thomas's movements. Thomas kept one arm around the girl, feeling the faint rise and fall of her breathing. Every breath mattered. Every moment mattered. As they rode through the growing storm, Thomas's thoughts raced. Who was she? How had she ended up hanging from a tree in the middle of nowhere? What had she gone through? He didn't know, and right now none of those answers mattered. All he knew was that she was alive, and he had to keep her that way. He whispered to her softly even though she couldn't hear him. He told her to stay with him, to keep breathing, to hold on. He didn't know why he spoke, but the words came naturally, as if his voice could help guide her back. The storm finally broke open. Rain poured down, lightning cracked across the sky, and thunder roared behind them. The horse kept moving, steady but quick, trusting Thomas's urgency. The rancher held the girl tighter, shielding her from the cold wind as best he could. Her head rested against his chest, her hair damp and tangled from the storm, and he could feel the fragile warmth still inside her. The ranch came into sight, a small cabin, a barn, and yards of fencing swaying under the wind. Thomas jumped down from the horse, lifted the girl gently, and carried her toward the cabin door. His boots splashed through puddles, and the rain soaked his clothes through, but he didn't slow down. He pushed the cabin door open with his shoulder, stepped inside, and kicked it shut behind him. The warmth inside was faint, the fire nearly burned out, but it was shelter, safety, a place where she could survive the night. He laid her on his bed carefully, almost afraid she might vanish if he moved too fast. Her breathing was still weak, but present. He hurried to the fireplace, adding wood and striking a flame until the fire came alive again. The cabin filled with a warm glow, and Thomas let out a long, shaky breath. He turned back to look at her. The girl was pale, bruised, and fragile, but she was breathing. Somehow she had survived the impossible. And now she was here, in his cabin, in his care. For the first time in years, Thomas felt something he couldn't name. Not fear, not sorrow. Something else, something like purpose. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But tonight he would do everything he could to keep her alive. She had taken her first breath in his arms, and that moment had changed everything. The storm outside continued to roar long after Thomas brought the girl into his cabin. Rain beat hard against the windows, making the whole cabin shiver. The wind rushed through the cracks in the wood, but the fire Thomas had built pushed back the cold. He knelt beside the girl again, studying her face in the warm glow. Her breathing was still soft and slow, and her eyes remained closed. But she was alive, and that was enough for him to keep going. Thomas took off his soaked coat and tossed it near the door. His clothes clung to his skin, and he was shivering himself, but he didn't care. His focus stayed on her. He pulled a blanket from his trunk and placed it over her, tucking the edges around her shoulders to keep her warm. The blanket was old but thick, one his mother had made many years ago. He hoped the warmth would reach the girl's cold skin soon. He noticed her wrists first. They carried deep rope marks, the skin red and bruised. Her arms had scratches, likely from branches or rough ground, and her neck had a faint dark band where the rope had pressed. Thomas swallowed hard, anger rising inside him, not at her, but at whoever had put her through such pain. He didn't know who they were or why they had done this, but he knew cruelty when he saw it. And this was something far worse than anything he had witnessed in years. He reached for a bowl and filled it with warm water from the pot by the fire. He grabbed a clean cloth and returned to her side. He worked slowly, gently cleaning the dirt and dried mud from her face and arms. Each time he touched her skin, she moved slightly, showing that she still felt something. Every small reaction gave him a strange sense of relief. It meant she was still fighting, still connected to this world. Thunder cracked again, shaking the cabin. The girl flinched faintly, her eyebrows tightening for a second, then relaxing. Thomas paused, watching her carefully, then continued cleaning her wounds. When he finished, he placed his hand lightly on her forehead. She was cold, too cold. He placed another blanket over her and checked the fire again, feeding it more wood until the flames grew brighter and stronger. Hours passed slowly. Thomas sat on the chair beside the bed, watching her breathing rise and fall. He didn't allow himself to sleep. He feared that if he closed his eyes even for a moment, something might happen. The storm outside finally began to calm in the early hours of the morning. The rain softened to a steady drizzle, and the wind settled into a distant whisper. But inside the cabin, the tension remained. By dawn, Thomas noticed a small change. Her breathing grew a little stronger, a little deeper. Her lips, once pale, were gaining a bit of color. Thomas leaned closer, listening carefully. He placed 2 fingers gently on her neck and felt a heartbeat. Weak, but steady. Relief washed over him so strongly that he exhaled without realizing he had been holding his breath for a long time. He stood up, stretched his tired back, and went to prepare some simple food. He filled a pot with water, set it near the fire, and added herbs and small pieces of vegetables he had stored. The smell slowly filled the cabin with warmth and comfort. He wasn't sure when she would wake up or if she would be able to eat, but he wanted something ready. When he returned to the bed, he caught a small movement. Her hand twitched. Her fingers curled slightly, then relaxed. Thomas froze, watching closely. Moments later, her eyelids fluttered, as if she was trying to open them but lacked the strength. He moved closer, his voice soft and careful. "You're safe. You're inside my cabin. You're not outside anymore." She didn't respond, but her breathing changed. It became uneven, almost anxious. Her eyes flickered again, and this time they opened a little. They were unfocused and cloudy at first, like she was trying to understand where she was. Thomas waited, giving her time. Finally, her gaze settled on him. She blinked slowly, her eyes heavy with exhaustion and fear. He raised his hands gently, palms open, showing he meant no harm. "You're safe here," he whispered. "I found you. I brought you inside. You're going to be okay." Her lips moved slightly, trying to form words. Her voice was faint, almost a breath more than speech. "Where?" she managed to whisper. "You're at my ranch," Thomas said softly. "My home. You were hanging from a tree, but you're alive. I won't let anything happen to you." Her eyes widened slightly at the mention of the tree, and she tried to sit up, but her body was too weak. Thomas reached forward quickly, steadying her shoulder. "Easy," he said gently. "Don't force yourself. You need to rest." She relaxed again, though her breathing was still shaky. She looked around the cabin, taking in the wooden walls, the fire, the blankets. Her gaze returned to Thomas, unsure, questioning. "Why, help me?" she whispered. Thomas smiled sadly, shaking his head. "Because you needed help," he said simply. "No one deserves to be left like that." Tears welled in her eyes, though she tried hard to hold them back. She wasn't ready to cry, not yet. Her throat moved as she swallowed, and she whispered, "Thank you." "You don't have to thank me," Thomas replied. "Just rest. I'll take care of everything." He offered her a bit of warm water in a cup, lifting it gently to her lips. She drank only a small sip, but it was enough. Her body relaxed slightly after the warmth touched her throat. Thomas placed the cup aside and adjusted the blankets again, making sure she stayed warm. Hours passed, and she drifted in and out of sleep. Each time she opened her eyes, she saw Thomas nearby, silent, patient, and steady. He didn't push her to speak. He didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. He simply made sure she felt safe. By afternoon, she was awake enough to speak a little more. Her voice was still weak, but clearer than before. When Thomas asked if she had any pain, she nodded slightly. He prepared a warm cloth and placed it gently on her bruises. She winced a little, but the warmth helped ease some of the discomfort. After some time, she gathered the strength to say her name. It came out quietly, almost shyly, as if she wasn't sure she should trust it to him. Thomas repeated it softly to show he had heard her. He told her his name as well, though she seemed too tired to respond. Later, while the fire crackled softly, she spoke again. Her voice trembled as she said she didn't know where her family was or if they were even alive. Fear shadowed her eyes, and she turned her head away to hide the emotion. Thomas felt a deep ache inside him as he watched her struggle. He couldn't promise her answers he didn't have, but he could promise protection, and he did. "You're safe here," he repeated gently. "No one will hurt you again, not while I'm here." She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also something else, a tiny spark of trust. It wasn't much, but it was real. As evening approached, she tried to sit up again, and Thomas helped her slowly. She ate a little soup, though her hands trembled, and she needed his help to keep the spoon steady. Afterward, she leaned back against the pillows, looking stronger than before. Thomas spent the evening repairing a loose board by the fireplace, glancing at her every few minutes to make sure she was still comfortable. She watched him silently, studying his calm movements, the way he took care of even the smallest things. It was clear she had not known many gentle people in her life. Before sleeping, she whispered softly, "Why were you there? Why did you find me?" Thomas paused, then answered honestly, "I don't know. Maybe I was meant to. Maybe you were meant to live." She looked at him, her eyes shining with tears she didn't let fall. That night, as she slept peacefully for the first time in a long time, Thomas sat beside the fire and stared at the flames. His cabin had been empty for years, filled only with silence and memories, but now, for the first time in a long while, it felt like life had returned. He didn't know why this girl had crossed his path, but he knew something had changed inside him the moment she took that small breath in his arms. And deep inside, he felt a quiet promise forming, one he wasn't even aware he was making. He would protect her. He would help her heal, and he would not let her face fear alone ever again. Days slowly blended into one another, and the girl grew a little stronger each sunrise. Her voice no longer shook every time she spoke, and she could sit up without Thomas holding her steady. Still, she moved carefully, like someone learning to trust her own body again. Thomas never hurried her. He treated each small improvement as something important, something that deserved quiet appreciation. Most mornings, Thomas would step outside early and return with a bucket of water, firewood, and sometimes fresh herbs or berries he found nearby. The girl would be awake by the time he came back, sitting quietly on the bed with the blanket around her shoulders. She watched him with calm eyes, no longer filled with fear. There was gratitude there now, and a kind of gentle trust that seemed to grow each day. One morning, when Thomas walked inside carrying a basket of firewood, He saw her standing for the first time. She held onto the bed frame to keep her balance, but she was on her feet. Her legs trembled and she looked tired, but she was trying. Thomas paused, his eyes widening with surprise before he quickly set the basket down and moved toward her. "You should sit," he said softly. "You're still weak." She shook her head, giving him a small smile. "I want to move. I don't want to stay in bed forever." Her voice was still quiet, but steadier than before. Thomas admired her determination. He offered his arm, and she took it, her hand trembling slightly. They walked slowly across the cabin, just a few steps, but for her, it felt like a long journey. When she finally sat down in the chair near the fire, she let out a soft breath of relief. Thomas poured her warm tea and placed it in her hands. She smiled again, and he felt something warm stir inside him. It wasn't loud or sudden. It was gentle, like the first warm breeze of spring after a long winter. Over the following days, she helped in small ways. She folded blankets, arranged the food shelf, or handed Thomas tools when he fixed something around the cabin. Anything more than that made her tired, but she insisted on trying. She didn't want to feel helpless. She wanted to feel like she belonged. One evening, as the sun painted the sky orange, Thomas took her outside for the first time. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and helped her to the wooden chair he had placed near the porch. The air was cool, carrying the fresh scent of grass and earth after recent rain. The girl closed her eyes and breathed in deeply. A peaceful smile spread across her face. "I miss the smell of open land," she whispered. Thomas sat beside her, leaning back slightly. "It's quiet here," he said. "Sometimes too quiet." "I like quiet," she replied. "It feels safe." They watched the sun sink behind the hills. The sky slowly changed from orange to purple, and the wind softened. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them felt comfortable, not empty. Eventually, she looked at him and said, "You've been very kind to me." "You needed help," Thomas said simply. "People don't always help," she whispered. Thomas didn't know what to say to that, but he understood the weight in her voice. As the days passed, her strength returned slowly. She walked more, sat outside in the sunlight, and helped prepare meals when she could. Thomas noticed how gentle she was with his horse, Dusty. She stroked its neck softly, speaking to it in a soothing tone that made the animal nuzzle her hand. Thomas watched from a distance, surprised at how quickly the horse trusted her. Animals rarely trusted easily, but she had a calming presence, something quiet and warm. One afternoon, Thomas found her sitting beside Dusty, humming a tune he didn't recognize. The horse stood beside her peacefully, as if enjoying the sound. Thomas smiled without realizing it. "You're good with him," he said. She turned, a bit startled that he had been watching, but she smiled back shyly. "Animals don't judge," she replied. "They feel your heart." Thomas nodded. "Dusty likes you." "Do you?" she asked softly. The question caught him off guard. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and then nodded slowly. "Yes," he finally said. "I do." She looked away, her cheeks warming. Thomas felt the same warmth in his own chest, but didn't say anything more. That evening, as they sat outside again, she finally gathered the courage to speak about her past. Her voice was slow and careful, as though every word required strength. She told him she had been traveling with her relatives, hoping to find a new place to settle. Their group had been peaceful and careful, avoiding trouble, but trouble found them anyway. A group of men had spotted their small travel party. They wanted supplies, but not only that. They wanted control. Her family resisted, trying to protect her and the others, but things went wrong. Voices turned to shouts. Shouts turned to violence. She didn't explain everything in detail, but Thomas didn't need details to understand. The pain in her voice told him enough. She described how she had been taken away from her group, tied up, and left alone for hours. She had tried to stay strong, tried to keep hope, but when they tied the rope around her neck, she believed her life was over. She felt the world darken, felt her breath slip away, and thought her last moment had come. Her voice trembled, but she continued speaking. "When I opened my eyes in your cabin," she whispered, "I thought maybe I was still dreaming, or maybe I was in some other world." Thomas listened without interrupting. He felt anger rise inside him, anger at the world, at the cruelty she had faced, at the fear she had carried. But he kept his voice steady. "You're safe now," he said softly. "You're here. No one will hurt you again." She nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I believe you." Tom felt something shift in the air when she said that. Trust wasn't something given lightly, especially not by someone who had suffered so much. Yet she trusted him. That meant more than any words could express. Days turned into weeks, and the girl regained most of her strength. She no longer needed Thomas to steady her when she walked. She helped him feed the horses, carry water, and cook simple meals. She laughed sometimes. Small, soft laughs that filled the cabin with warmth Thomas had not felt in years. Town people soon noticed that Thomas wasn't alone anymore. When he rode into town for supplies, the girl sat behind him on the horse, holding on to him gently. People stared, curious about who she was, where she came from, and why she stayed with him. Some whispered, but Thomas ignored them. He had never cared much for gossip. The girl, however, felt nervous around crowds. She stayed close to Thomas, her hand lightly gripping his jacket. Thomas noticed every small sign of fear she carried, and he stayed beside her, blocking any curious stares with his quiet, steady presence. One evening, as they returned to the ranch, she told him something that surprised him. "I dreamed about that day again," she said quietly. "The day I almost died." Thomas slowed his steps, listening. "But this time," she continued, "I didn't feel fear. I remembered you holding me. I remembered your voice telling me to stay alive, and that made the dream different, less dark." Thomas swallowed hard, unsure how to answer, but she reached out and took his hand, her fingers gentle and warm. "You didn't just save my life," she said. "You gave me a place to breathe again." Thomas felt his chest tighten, not with pain, but with emotion he hadn't felt in many years. He didn't know how to respond, but he didn't have to. She squeezed his hand lightly, then let go, walking ahead with a peaceful smile. That night, as they sat by the fire, the cabin felt completely changed. It was no longer just a shelter. It felt like a home. The air carried warmth, comfort, and a quiet bond growing stronger with each day. Thomas realized something he had pushed away for years. He wasn't meant to live his life alone. And she, despite everything she had been through, wasn't broken. She was strong, gentle, and full of life. Together, they were slowly healing, each in their own way. The silence that once filled the ranch was no longer empty. It was full of meaning, full of unspoken understanding. And without planning it, without saying it out loud, Thomas began to hope for something he never thought he would have again: a future. Spring slowly began to settle across the land, bringing warmer air, new colors, and a gentle feeling of change. The ranch no longer felt like an empty space surrounded by silence. Now it carried the sound of footsteps, soft laughter, the movement of animals, and the quiet conversations shared during early mornings and late evenings. The girl, whose life Thomas had saved, walked with steady legs now. Her voice, once weak and unsure, had grown calm and warm. She no longer woke in fear, no longer flinched at every sound, and no longer sat alone staring into the distance as though expecting shadows to return. Every day felt like a small step toward something brighter. Thomas often watched her from a distance when she didn't notice. He watched the way she touched the horses with gentle hands, the way she smiled when Dusty nudged her shoulder, the way she hummed while fetching water or sweeping the porch. He watched the way she stood in the sunlight, her hair moving softly in the breeze. Her eyes closed as though she was soaking in life she once thought she had lost forever. There was peace in her now, growing little by little every day. One morning she woke early and made breakfast, while Thomas was outside feeding the cattle. When he returned to the cabin, he saw a plate waiting on the table. She stood nearby, looking a little nervous, as though unsure whether she had done the right thing. Thomas smiled softly and nodded, grateful in his quiet way. It had been a long time since anyone cooked for him. A long time since anyone cared enough to. "You don't have to do this," Thomas said. "I want to," she replied simply. Her words carried warmth, and something inside Thomas shifted again. Some part of him that he thought had dried up years ago. The days continued in this gentle rhythm. They worked side by side, repairing the barn roof. She held the ladder steady while Thomas hammered nails into new boards. She gathered fallen branches and stacked them neatly for firewood. They planted new seeds in a small patch of ground behind the cabin. She kneeled in the dirt with her hands covered in soil, smiling as though planting life gave her strength. Thomas bought new supplies from town, and she arranged everything neatly on the shelves. She stayed. Day after day, she stayed. Thomas didn't know if she remained because she needed time or because she chose the ranch over the unknown world beyond it. He didn't ask. He feared that asking might remind her she had the option to leave. And though he wanted her to live freely, the thought of the cabin becoming empty again made his heart twist with a quiet ache. One evening, after finishing their work, she told him she wanted to visit the place where he had found her. Thomas hesitated. He didn't want her to return to that painful memory, but the determination in her eyes was gentle and firm. She said softly, "I need to face it." So they rode out together the next morning while the sky was still cool. Thomas led the way, guiding Dusty toward the distant tree. The land around them was peaceful now, green with new grass and wild flowers pushing through the dirt. It felt far different from the stormy day he had found her hanging lifeless. Still, as they approached the tree, Thomas felt a heaviness return to his chest. The girl stepped down from the horse on her own. She approached the tree slowly, touching its rough bark with careful fingers. She stood still for a long moment, breathing deeply. Her eyes calm but thoughtful. Thomas stayed behind her, giving her space while also staying close enough in case she needed him. "This is where my life almost ended," she whispered. "But it's also where it began again." Thomas watched her with quiet respect. Her voice didn't shake. Her posture didn't show fear. She seemed peaceful, even strong. Something in her had healed far deeper than he realized. She knelt down and touched the earth near the base of the tree. Thomas noticed she was tracing the ground with her fingers, drawing a small shape, maybe a circle or a simple mark only she understood. Then she stood up and looked at Thomas. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" he asked. "For giving me another chance," she replied. "For not walking away. For carrying me when I couldn't move. For letting me heal without asking anything in return." Thomas opened his mouth, but no words came. He wasn't a man fluent with emotions. He wasn't used to people thanking him for anything. He simply nodded, his eyes lowering slightly. She took a deep breath and continued. "I couldn't breathe that day. I felt the world slipping away. But then, I woke up in your cabin. You gave me hope when I thought none existed." She stepped closer. "That matters more than you think." Thomas felt his throat tighten. He quickly turned toward the horse, pretending to adjust the reins, giving himself a moment to steady his emotions. She watched him with a soft smile, knowing he wasn't avoiding her. He was simply overwhelmed. They returned to the ranch, and life continued with newfound calm. Each day felt stronger than the last. She laughed more now, gentle laughs that made the cabin feel warmer. Thomas found himself speaking more too. He told her stories about his childhood, about his parents, and about how he learned ranch work. She listened with curiosity, asking questions and smiling at his memories. One evening they sat on the porch as the sky turned orange. Birds flew overhead, settling into their nests for the night. She leaned back in her chair, wrapped in a blanket, and looked at the land stretching out before them. "Do you ever feel lonely here?" she asked quietly. "I used to," Thomas admitted, "but not anymore." She turned to look at him, her eyes soft. "I'm glad." He wasn't sure how to explain what she meant to him now. He wasn't sure how to say that her presence changed everything, that he didn't want the days to return to the empty silence they once carried. Instead, he reached over, gently placing his hand near hers. She moved her hand slightly until their fingers touched. It was a small gesture, gentle and quiet, but it felt like the beginning of something real. As more weeks passed, their bond deepened naturally. Not forced, not rushed. Simple moments filled their days, working together, sharing meals, sitting by the fire, listening to the wind outside. She learned how to mend fences. He taught her how to ride confidently. She showed him how to prepare simple herbal remedies her family used to make. He showed her how to read weather signs by watching the clouds. One morning, a neighbor rode by and saw the two of them repairing a fence. He waved from a distance, surprised to see Thomas smiling, a sight rare for many years. When the neighbor asked later in town who the girl was, Thomas answered simply, "Someone important." The girl heard his words later and smiled quietly to herself. One night, a soft rain fell outside. The cabin was warm, lit by the flickering fire. The girl sat on the floor brushing Dusty's mane as the horse poked its head into the cabin doorway, seeking attention. Thomas watched her from the table, his heart full in a way he rarely understood. She glanced up and said, "I think this ranch feels like home." Thomas felt something stir deep inside him. He approached slowly, sitting beside her as Dusty nudged them both. The girl placed her hand on Thomas's arm, a gesture filled with meaning. "You saved me," she whispered. "But you also gave me a place to belong." Thomas swallowed hard, emotion tightening his chest. "You don't owe me anything," he said softly. "I know," she replied. "I'm here because I want to be." He looked into her eyes and saw nothing but sincerity. Gratitude, trust, warmth. The cabin, once cold and lonely, now felt alive. It carried laughter, footsteps, shared meals, and quiet conversations that lasted late into the night. The ranch that once echoed with wind now echoed with hope. Together they buried the last memory of her past, the fear, the pain, the loneliness, deep into the earth. And together, they began building a future made not of dramatic promises, but of simple choices made every day, kindness, trust, and the will to stay. Thomas had lived alone for years, convinced that life had already taken everything from him. But the day he found a girl hanging from a tree and watched her breathe in his arms, everything changed. It was the moment that brought her back to life, and the moment that brought life back to him.